What if I told you that some of the darkest secrets of World War II were never meant to see the light of day? We're not talking about ordinary history, we're talking about underground experiments, buried trains, sealed vaults, and forgotten mass graves. These are the stories the Nazis tried to erase, hidden for decades, until now. From horrifying discoveries to chilling evidence of lost projects, these 5 forgotten horrors will change how you see World War II forever. In the frozen wilderness of northern Greenland, something unimaginable lay hidden for decades beneath layers of ice and secrecy. It was not until the summer of 2013, when accelerated melting from global warming exposed part of the Arctic landscape that had been untouched since World War II, that the chilling truth emerged. The discovery began innocuously enough. A team of climate researchers from Denmark stumbled across a strange metallic shape protruding from the edge of a melting glacier. Upon closer inspection, they realized it wasn't just a rock formation or leftover machinery. It was a rusted-over U.S. Army truck from the 1940s, perfectly preserved in the cold. Excavation quickly revealed more. Several vehicles, crates of equipment, and parts of what appeared to be buildings were trapped under layers of ice. When news reached the U.S. Department of Defense, a discreet archaeological team was dispatched under the guise of scientific support. What they uncovered was the forgotten remnants of Camp Century, a Cold War base initially known to researchers as an abandoned nuclear-powered research facility. But what the public had never known, and what this discovery would finally confirm, was that Camp Century was built upon a deeper foundation of World War II secrets. Long before the Cold War installations, this site had served as a covert operations post during World War II, strategically placed to monitor potential Nazi movement through the Arctic. At the time, Nazi Germany had been exploring Arctic routes and weather manipulation experiments in what was later dubbed Project Frostwolf, a little-known operation rumored among war historians but never proven. Now, for the first time, physical evidence was being unearthed. Within the icebound bunkers, the team found crates stamped with a U.S. War Department seal, labeled with code names long erased from any declassified documents. One crate contained stacks of yellowing files, weather pattern analyses, enemy tracking logs, and, most disturbingly, interrogation transcripts from captured Nazi officers. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war. The files described them as defectors with elite scientific knowledge, brought to Greenland under a special directive called Operation Embervale. According to the records, the Germans had been working on a method to weaponize weather by manipulating jet streams and causing artificial blizzards over enemy territories. The operation seemed like science fiction, but the transcripts hinted at real attempts, failed or otherwise. One account told of a test in 1944 that allegedly caused an unseasonal storm in Murmansk, crippling Soviet supply lines. Another revealed a plan to freeze key Allied ports in Newfoundland by seeding clouds with silver iodide and magnetic particles, a technique that eerily mirrored later Cold War weather experiments. But that wasn't the darkest part. Deeper into the facility, the team uncovered a sealed chamber encased in permafrost, containing what appeared to be lab equipment. Strange machines with dials marked in both English and German, frozen vials, and jars of unknown substances. A small safe was found bolted to the wall, and after hours of cautious work, they managed to open it. Inside were several film reels, labeled Frostwolf, Session Logs 1-4. The reels were transferred to a secure U.S. military lab and analyzed over several months. The footage was grainy but unmistakable, Nazi and American scientists together, discussing the potential of Arctic domination through weather warfare. What stunned analysts most was not the collaboration itself. Covert alliances were not unheard of, but the clear presence of high-ranking U.S. intelligence figures who had never been publicly linked to such wartime programs. It seemed that Camp Century had doubled as a secret Nazi defector research base, repurposing enemy knowledge for the Allied cause. This directly contradicted decades of U.S. denials regarding the use of Nazi scientific personnel outside of Operation Paperclip. Then came the environmental shock. Many of the barrels found near the lab chamber were leaking, even after all these years. Testing revealed them to be radioactive, containing a compound similar to reactor coolant. It turned out that the facility had dumped waste from experimental nuclear weather devices directly into the ice below, assuming it would remain frozen forever. But the rapid thaw of the Arctic was now causing this contamination to seep into nearby water sources, sparking international concern and quiet emergency meetings among NATO nations. As the truth surfaced, journalists and historians scrambled to put together the implications. The U.S. government remained mostly silent, issuing a brief statement acknowledging historical research activity in Greenland but denying knowledge of any joint scientific endeavors with wartime enemies. Yet the documents and footage said otherwise. To locals in Greenland, especially members of the Inuit community, the revelation explained long-standing myths passed down for generations. Tales of iron whales beneath the snow and men who made storms had often been dismissed as folklore. But now, those cryptic stories found context. One elder recalled her grandfather describing a winter where the northern lights vanished for days and the snow turned to needles. The timing matched one of the supposed test dates mentioned in the Project Frostwolf files. The most unsettling part of all was the final reel, partially degraded and missing audio. It showed a group of scientists around a blackboard, sketching out what looked like a hurricane being redirected toward the eastern U.S. coastline. Though it appeared theoretical, some believe it might have been a real plan, perhaps one never carried out due to Germany's surrender. As efforts continue to recover and study what remains beneath the Greenland ice sheet, one thing is clear. World War II didn't end when the bombs stopped falling. Its ghost lingered in frozen chambers, hidden agendas, and buried lies that have only now begun to thaw into light. In the heart of central France, surrounded by hills and meadows, lies the silent village of Oradour-sur-Glane. Preserved in ruin since 1944, it stands as a memorial to one of the most horrific massacres committed on French soil during World War II. On June 10 of that year, the Waffen-SS surrounded the peaceful town and, by the end of the day, 642 civilians were dead. Men, women, and children, all slaughtered in an act of brutal retaliation. The village was never rebuilt. Instead, it was left exactly as it was found after the massacre: homes burned, bicycles rusting, sewing machines still on tables, and the charred skeleton of the church at its center. For decades, Oradour-sur-Glane remained untouched, sacred and solemn, a museum of horror. But in early 2020, a historical preservation team was given permission to perform ground-penetrating radar surveys beneath the old church, intending to stabilize the foundation and prevent collapse. What they found instead was something never before documented in official records. The radar scans revealed a small, sealed stone chamber beneath the sanctuary, completely undisturbed. Hidden under layers of collapsed brick and scorched pews, the chamber was likely overlooked during early post-war investigations. After careful excavation, the team opened the forgotten vault and found what could only be described as a clandestine crypt. Inside were skeletal remains. 5 individuals huddled together in a corner, far fewer than the 247 women and children who were officially known to have died in the church that day. The initial assumption was that these were victims who had attempted to escape and became trapped. But what disturbed investigators more than the remains was what was clutched in the tiny, calcified hands of one of the skeletons, a leather-bound diary, miraculously intact despite the fire. The handwriting inside was in delicate cursive, childlike and precise. It belonged to a 13-year-old girl named Elise Martin, who had kept the diary hidden in her apron. The entries began in early May 1944, just a month before the massacre, and told the story of her daily life in the village. Her love for her dog Papillon, helping her mother make bread, playing with her friend Louise. But as the entries continued into June, they became darker, more anxious. One entry from June 5 read, "Maman says we must keep quiet about what the man said. He is staying with Madame Charpentier now. He has a gun. I don't like him. He scares the hens." This reference puzzled historians. Who was the man? And why was he staying secretly in the village? A few pages later, Elise wrote something chilling. Maman argued with the man again. He says the Germans are coming, but it will be okay if we let them take it. He says we will be safe. But Maman says we must not trust traitors. As the team deciphered more entries, a shocking narrative unfolded. Elise had unknowingly recorded the presence of a French collaborator, a Vichy sympathizer or possibly a double agent, who had taken refuge in the village. The diary implied that he had made a deal with the approaching Waffen-SS to surrender a resistance cache in exchange for sparing Oradauer. That cache, as it turned out, had recently been moved into the church's cellar, hidden within crates labeled as religious artifacts. The Germans, arriving on June 10 under the pretense of searching for resistance fighters, may have known exactly where to look. But something went wrong. Perhaps the cache had been moved again. Perhaps the collaborator lied. In retaliation, the SS troops unleashed unspeakable terror. The final entry in Elise's diary was dated the very morning of the massacre. In shaky handwriting, she wrote, "We are hiding now. Maman says we must not cry. I can hear fire. The man is gone. I don't think he was ever going to save us." The identity of the man remains unconfirmed, but the diary offered investigators new leads. Cross-referencing names from the village registry, they discovered that one resident disappeared shortly after the massacre, presumed dead though his body was never found. Further research into Vichy archives revealed he had once been an informant for the Milice, the paramilitary force that assisted the Nazis in tracking down Jews and resistance members. The implications were staggering. While the massacre itself was never in doubt, Elise's diary suggested that it might not have been entirely random. It may have been the result of a betrayal from within, a deal gone wrong that doomed the entire village. French authorities were hesitant to release this information publicly, fearing it would tarnish the village's legacy as a symbol of innocent martyrdom. But the diary, now housed in a secure archive near Limoges, was undeniable. Meanwhile, the remains found in the chamber were carefully analyzed. DNA comparisons identified one as Elise herself. Another, older, was presumed to be her mother. The three others remain unnamed, but likely sought shelter alongside them. They were found curled together, as if waiting in silence while death raged above them. The revelation of the crypt caused ripples not just in France, but among World War II historians globally. Oradour-sur-Glane had always stood as a symbol of senseless brutality. Now, it also symbolized the danger of silence, secrecy, and the consequences of betrayal in times of war. For many, Elise's diary became a voice that had waited 76 years to be heard. Visitors still walk the ruins of Oradauer today, tracing the steps of those who died, staring into the rusted cars and scorched sewing machines left behind. But now, they do so with a deeper understanding that even in the face of atrocity, small stories can emerge to shift the weight of history. And sometimes, the dead speak not through monuments or museums, but through a child's trembling hand gripping a diary in the dark. In the quiet hills of central Germany, beneath layers of limestone and forgotten earth, an ancient salt mine concealed a horrifying secret lost in time. Known as the Altmark salt mines, the tunnels stretched for miles beneath the surface, once used for mineral extraction and then abandoned in the early 1900s. But in 2018, a group of amateur spelunkers entered the mine during an unsanctioned exploration, expecting to find only old mining equipment and perhaps a few bats. Instead, they stumbled upon a tunnel blocked by a rusted steel door bearing faded German script, Zutritt verboten, Hochsicherheitsbereich, no entry, high security area. It was the start of one of the most disturbing archaeological discoveries in post-war Europe. Authorities were quickly alerted, and soon, a professional team arrived. Once the path was cleared and the door forced open, what they discovered was a sealed Nazi research facility, perfectly preserved in the cool, dry conditions of the salt mine. The initial corridor was narrow, lined with exposed wiring and lead shielding, leading to a chamber filled with crates, scientific instruments, and faded flags bearing the black and white eagle insignia of the Third Reich. The walls were lined with charts, hand-drawn blueprints, and fragments of typed documents. But what caught the attention of the excavation team were several metal containers labeled Urine Project, KZ Material, Stuff 3. These words meant only one thing: Uranium Project, Concentration Camp Material, Stage 3. The implications were staggering. For decades, historians had known of Nazi Germany's failed attempt to develop a nuclear weapon. Their project, the WWII, was never believed to have reached advanced testing stages, especially after key setbacks and Allied bombings. But this hidden lab, buried and forgotten, told a different story. Among the papers were technical notes detailing crude reactor designs and high-risk containment setups. More chillingly, there were logs documenting human exposure experiments, with results meticulously recorded, symptoms, timelines, fatalities. Names were absent, only prisoner numbers. It quickly became clear that the facility had been a clandestine testing ground, shielded not just from the Allies, but possibly even from segments of the Nazi high command itself. The real horror came when one of the inner rooms was opened. It contained a row of sealed steel coffins, each marked only by a code. When opened, they revealed the skeletal remains of human test subjects, emaciated and twisted in ways that suggested radiation sickness. Forensic analysis later confirmed high levels of isotopes embedded in their bones. These individuals had not just been exposed to radiation, they had been intentionally irradiated as part of weapons research. Further investigation of the remains, including DNA testing, revealed a haunting anomaly. None of the genetic profiles matched known victims from concentration camps. These were not prisoners documented at Auschwitz, Dachau, or Bergen-Belsen. They had no Nazi records. They did not exist in any file or database. This led to the theory of the ghost camp. Somewhere, deep in the Nazi camp network, there may have existed an off-book facility, housing individuals used solely for secret experimentation, never registered, never liberated, never mourned. If true, this meant entire families could have vanished without a trace, not even recorded as victims of the Holocaust. The documents mentioned a name, Stalinwerk 12, believed to be either a code name for the secret camp or an alias for the underground program itself. Notes from a captured SS scientist in a separate archive in Argentina referenced a Stalinwerk unit that was buried beneath the salt and never to be unearthed. At the time, it was dismissed as metaphor or paranoia. Now, it appeared to be literal. But the facility held even more secrets. In a locked archive room, engineers found several rolls of microfilm. After delicate restoration, the film revealed photographs of early nuclear assembly attempts, crudely constructed atomic cores, with prisoners forced to assist under the watchful eye of uniformed officers. In one photo, a child appears, no older than 12, holding a metal cylinder with gloved hands and a blank stare. Notes attached to the image refer to him only as Testnabe 37, Testboy 37. The presence of children in such a place suggested an even more depraved level of experimentation. The goal, one translated note claimed, was to test long-term mutation potential in low-yield isotope exposure. They were not just building a bomb, they were trying to see what kind of human could survive it. Questions quickly arose about how the site could have remained untouched for over 70 years. Some believe the facility was deliberately sealed by retreating SS troops in 1945, long after Hitler's official bunker fell. Others theorize that knowledge of its existence was buried intentionally by Allied intelligence, particularly the Americans, who were eager to scoop up German scientists and technology through Operation Paperclip. Could it be that some of the scientists from this very lab were smuggled to the US and lived out their days building weapons for a new superpower? The German government responded to the discovery with tight-lipped formality. The site was cordoned off, and only select historians and investigators were allowed access. A few journalists leaked details, but most mainstream outlets avoided the story, perhaps due to the political sensitivity or the lack of full documentation. But within the academic world, the implications were enormous. Here was proof not only of a deeper, darker Nazi nuclear program than previously believed, but of a secret genocide within the Holocaust, victims entirely erased from the historical record. People who died in darkness, under the earth, with no name, no number, and no grave. Memorial stones have since been placed at the entrance to the Altmark salt mines, though no official ceremony has ever been held. The local town, once oblivious to the horror beneath their feet, now lives with the knowledge that history's most terrible secrets can sleep for decades in silence, and that truth, once uncovered, can shake the foundations of memory itself. The tale had circulated for years among villagers in the southern Czech Republic, a ghost train, armored and silent, buried beneath a hill outside the town of Bruntel. Locals whispered that it had been seen once during the war, its wheels screeching in the dead of night as it vanished into a tunnel sealed by explosions days later. Most dismissed it as folklore, until 2015, when a pair of treasure hunters using deep penetrating radar near the Yosemite Mountains claimed to have found something extraordinary beneath the forest floor. Roughly 400 meters beneath a collapsed tunnel, a radar signature emerged. Long, metallic, and unmistakably shaped like a multi-carriage train. What followed was a months-long international effort to reach the site, with funding quietly funneled from both Czech authorities and private investors, including several from Germany and Israel. When the tunnel was finally breached and the first glimpse of the train was made through a camera drone, the world was not prepared for what was inside. The train was real. It was heavily armored, painted black, its insignias faded but clearly of the Third Reich. Inside the lead car were crates of stolen artwork, gold bars bearing the stamp of the Reichsbank, and bundles of currency from over a dozen occupied nations. It was part of the long-speculated Nazi ghost convoy, a last-ditch attempt by the crumbling regime to smuggle treasure and possibly key personnel out of Germany in the final weeks of the war. But the treasure, as it turned out, was only the surface of what this buried train had carried. In the passenger cars, investigators found sealed compartments, cell-like rooms lined with steel, containing the skeletal remains of over 100 individuals, still shackled to benches and gurneys. They were mostly men and boys, and early forensics revealed they were likely of Jewish and Romani origin. But what startled researchers was not just the presence of prisoners, it was the markings tattooed crudely into their skin. Each bore a symbol, almost ritualistic in appearance, which did not match any standard Nazi identification codes. Hidden among their remains were notebooks, written in German by a man known only as Dr. W. Weishaupt. His journal entries detailed what he called the Human Occult Project, a secret program authorized by Himmler himself under the Ahnenerbe, the SS Mystical Research Division. The project's goal was to harness supernatural powers through the suffering of spiritually marked individuals, who were selected not only for their ethnicity but because they were believed to be spiritually resonant. Some, according to Weishaupt, had been taken from synagogues in Prague, where rabbis had preserved old Kabbalistic scrolls the Nazis deemed of mystical value. The journal described horrific experiments, forced chanting of sacred texts, sensory deprivation in total darkness, and exposure to symbols carved in blood. The aim, Weishaupt wrote, was to concentrate the soul into light, believing that certain deaths could generate supernatural energy usable in Nazi rituals or even weaponization. Most chilling was an entry dated April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's death, which read, "The ritual is complete. The energy has not manifested as expected. We must take them to the Black Vault before Allied forces arrive. The train will depart tonight. God, or whatever remains, have mercy on us." The Black Vault, referenced repeatedly, was believed by historians to be a code name for a hidden SS archive rumored to be buried in the Alps. But the implication here was that the train itself was the vault, a mobile tomb carrying not just treasure, but the final remnants of Nazi occult experiments, meant to be hidden forever in the earth. Even more disturbing were the audio cylinders found in the command car, old phonographic recordings labeled trial invocations. Experts from the Israeli Antiquities Authority and European universities worked together to decipher the sound. What they uncovered was a mix of Hebrew, Latin, and archaic German, repeated in haunting monotone. Several scholars recognized fragments of ancient protective prayers, though twisted and inverted. One tape, when played back in reverse, seemed to chant a single name repeatedly, Samuel, the angel of death in certain mystical traditions. By now, the operation had drawn global attention. Governments demanded access. Religious authorities called for respectful burial of the remains. Conspiracy theorists flooded forums with talk of Nazi black magic, cursed gold, and the train that should never be opened. Then, as if scripted by fate, tragedy struck. 3 members of the excavation team, including a historian and a military engineer, died suddenly within a week of each other. One in a car accident, another by heart failure, and the third by suicide. Rumors swirled, made worse when the security team guarding the site reported hearing voices from inside the train, whispers in languages no one could recognize. Some refused to return. A priest from nearby Olomouc was called to perform a blessing over the train site. The reports say he left visibly shaken, refusing to speak about what he felt there. Eventually, The Czech government ordered the trains sealed again and declared the entire site a restricted heritage zone. Only a fraction of its contents were removed, mostly the gold and the documents. The rest remained buried, along with the shadows of those who died inside. To this day, no one knows where Dr. Weishaupt went after that final journal entry. His name appears on no captured Nazi list. His work has never been seen outside of that one train. Whether he was killed before the train departed or escaped into obscurity remains one of the many unanswered questions. But what cannot be denied is that the train of lost souls was real, and its existence proved that some corners of the war were darker than anyone imagined. And perhaps, some trains were meant to stay buried, not for the treasure, but for the horrors that traveled with them. For decades, the Nazi death camp of Sobibór in eastern Poland was overshadowed by its more infamous counterparts, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. Sobibór had no surviving buildings, no iconic gates or towering chimneys. The Nazis had deliberately destroyed it in 1943 following a prisoner uprising, covering the camp with earth and planting trees to erase it from memory. Survivors were few. Records were scarce. What remained was silence, until a team of Israeli and Polish archaeologists, led by Dr. Yoram Jaime, began excavating the site in 2007. Over more than a decade of meticulous digging, the team unearthed gas chamber foundations, a hidden escape tunnel, and personal items like jewelry, eyeglasses, and children's shoes. But in 2023, using advanced soil imaging and underground LiDAR, they uncovered a previously unknown substructure beneath the camp's execution area, a low stone corridor leading into the earth. It was located under what survivors had referred to as the path to heaven, a camouflaged passage leading victims to their deaths. This chamber had no mention in any testimony. It was small, lined with carved stone, and sealed by a collapsed hatch. When opened, the smell of rot and dust burst forth, untouched for 80 years. Inside, to the shock of everyone, were shelves of scrolls, manuscripts, and bound books, hundreds of them, wrapped in tarpaulin, buried with intent. The first assumption was that they were religious texts, hidden Torahs, perhaps, rescued by prisoners. But as the pages were carefully unraveled in a temperature-controlled lab, something far more unusual came to light. Many of the texts were handwritten journals, written in Yiddish, Hebrew, German, and Polish. They bore the signatures of prisoners, rabbis, scholars, poets. Some had dates going back to early 1942. They were not memoirs written after the war, but documents composed during it, in secret. And they all had one goal: to preserve truth in the face of annihilation. They called themselves the Witnesses Under Ash, a secret literary collective formed by inmates who understood that they were going to die, but were determined to leave behind a record the Nazis could not erase. They hid their writings in clay jars, bread crusts, and false walls. But this chamber was different. It had been designed, constructed by someone with resources, planning, and architectural knowledge. As archaeologists examined the structure, they noticed signs of German engineering. Concrete reinforcement, drainage systems, and even a primitive ventilation shaft. This chamber had not been built by prisoners, it had been repurposed by them. Historical cross-referencing revealed that in the early 1940s, the site had once been a Soviet storage depot before the German occupation. The prisoners had discovered this old substructure and used it as a vault, a tomb of testimony. Inside were not only words, but drawings, haunting sketches of life inside the camp, etched in charcoal on paper scraps. One depicted a man playing a violin while children watched, surrounded by guards. Another showed the cremation pits in harrowing detail. One simply portrayed a star, 6 points surrounded by flames, with the words, Zeit sich in Gedenken, remember us. The most astonishing find, however, came from a set of bound papers held together with wire. They were the writings of a young man named Avi Mendelssohn, age 19, a Warsaw University student arrested in 1941. His journal was philosophical, analytical, and devastating. He chronicled life in Sobibór day by day, documenting executions, selections, hunger, disease, hope, and collapse. His words burned with clarity. One entry read, "They kill us not only with gas and fire, but with forgetfulness." They believe they can erase us by erasing where we die. But they forget, we are not ash. We are ink. And ink survives the flame. What made Avi's writing even more valuable was that he described conversations and interactions with Nazi officers, details no other sources contained. He mentioned a Captain Heinrich Weller, a man not listed in any known camp rosters, who allegedly oversaw unofficial experiments with psychological torture. One note described how Weller forced prisoners to dig trenches for weeks that led nowhere, just to observe the effects of false hope. These accusations, once deemed hearsay, now had documentation. In the final pages of Avi's writings was a description of the 1943 uprising, how prisoners planned the revolt by secretly forging weapons from spare metal and memorizing guard rotations. But Avi did not survive. His last entry ends mid-sentence. If we succeed, let them find this and know, not all of us died as lambs. Some died. The rest is smudged in blood. Archaeologists and historians agreed this was the largest intact collection of prisoner writings ever found from the Holocaust. Unlike diaries discovered in hiding places after the war, these were created inside the death machine, in real time, by people who knew they would not leave alive. Their voices reached out from the grave, not begging for pity, but demanding remembrance. The chamber was later named the Archive of the Burned, and a full digital restoration project began to preserve each page. But controversy followed. Some Polish nationalist groups pushed back against expanding Sobibor's memorial to include the new findings, citing logistical and budgetary reasons. Others feared the site would become a target of neo-Nazi desecration. But survivors and scholars persisted. By 2024, the Sobibór chamber was reopened to a limited group of descendants and educators. Among them was Leah Mendelssohn, the grandniece of Avi, who had never known she had family that died in the Holocaust. When she read his words, she wept and whispered, "You were not forgotten. You were never ash." And so, beneath the ashes of a forgotten camp, voices once silenced were heard again. They had waited beneath the soil, behind stone and secrecy, for nearly a century, not to accuse, not to condemn, but to speak. And now that they had, they would not be buried again. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?